I thought, panel, what we would do before we kicked off the stage by the Vice President of the European Commission is to start global and then work down to local by the end of the discussion. It seems to me that for a business audience, the case for trade is self-evident, does not need even to be made. Clearly, trade is sort of controversial, as is globalization. So, first of all, a two-part question I'll ask more or less all of you, and you can answer the way you want, all of you, starting with you, Ferdi. Why is trade so important to Europe? It seems to go back to first principles. Why is trade so important to the European economy? But linked to that, why is globalization so unpopular, and why are efforts by industry to make the case for globalization, trade, not always quite effective? You start, my friend.
Yes, with your first question, I think trade has always been at the heart of European integration. Trade policy has been competence of the European Union from the very beginning, from the Rome treaties onwards. Due to its market size, which has expanded after consecutive enlargements, of course, trade policy has always been an important instrument for the EU to have influence in world affairs. Also, I think because the EU is missing a number of traditional foreign policy instruments. There's no European army to use military means to have influence in world affairs like other countries do. So I think that's a very short answer to your first question, why trade policy is important and I think has always been central to European politics or EU politics. Your second question is the more difficult one, of course. I think on the one hand, some criticisms on globalization, on trade deals, contain elements of exaggeration. That's part of how politics, but also lobbying, NGO work works, of course. But I think some concerns do make much sense. If we look at economic theory, what does it say us? What does it learn us about trades? Well, it says that free trades can be beneficial, but only if two conditions are met. First, if the gains from trades are redistributed. So it was mentioned in the previous speech, trade not only produces winners, but also losers. So first condition is that the losers from trades are compensated. And the second condition is that so-called negative externalities, extra pollution, for example, that come with trade liberalization are addressed. And I think if you want to summarize the serious criticisms, the serious concerns about globalization and recent trade deals, it's that NGOs think that these two conditions today are insufficiently met. And that's not only due to trade deals themselves, but also, as was said in the previous speech, due to domestic politics, social protection systems, for example, that don't sufficiently redistribute the gains from trade as they maybe did in the first decades after the Second World War. So I think if you want me to summarize, the criticisms on globalization and trade deals today, and only look at the serious criticisms, it's that some serious critical voices think that these two conditions under which free trade is really desirable, optimal, are not sufficiently met nowadays.
Okay. Well, maybe a similar question to you then, Bernard, which is so trade, you mentioned winners and losers, Ferdi. So trade equals trade-offs. It implies trade-offs. How is there any way around that? There will inevitably be winners and losers, and then the question should be, to use your word, Ferdi, how can compensation be introduced into the system to make up for the people losing out? Is it inevitably trade and globalization going to create two categories, winners and losers?
Yeah, I think first of all, I agree completely that the trade is a big and a huge engine for creating prosperity and growth and jobs. Of course, there is, and certainly now it's important due to the fact that we, and certainly in Belgium, with the CETA, there comes over that there are some, let us say, real, and what Ferdi told us, let us say, goods good discussions and false discussions. And of course, you have in trade, you will have winners and you will have losers. But that's policy that has to underline this and to mitigate it. But like Belgium, I'm the chairman of the Belgian industry, 85% of our GDP is on trade. When you see the single market is 500 million people, we have to, it's enormous. We have now to do the same trade with reciprocity, typically with China. And then, of course, you have the dialogue. I think a dialogue, the missing dialogue. People in Ivory Tower discussed about agreements, and population don't understand. There is no, let us say, good discussion and explanation of the reasons of trade.
Okay. Over to you now. I was struck by in Sari's speech. She mentioned twice, I think, NGOs, and you mentioned as well, Ferdi. I mean, at the height of the TTIP stuff, and maybe CETA as well, which kind of was tagged on it towards the end, it got very unpleasant, got very heated, but quite nasty, the discussion seems to me. But somehow, Sweden, not for the first time, manages to kind of buck the trend, and you seem to engage in a very constructive way, not just the trade unions, but also with civil society, NGOs, the broader community, the stakeholder community. I mean, what for you, for a Swedish entrepreneur and businesswoman like you are, was that just a no-brainer? That's how things are done in Sweden. And if so, why didn't the rest of Europe follow more the Swedish example?
Well, I think that one of the reasons that things are the way they are in Sweden, where even the labor unions think that globalization and trade is a good thing, right, is that I think somehow the basis for several of your discussions are that, you know, there are winners and losers. Well, you know, trade actually only happens when both parties think that they win. Right. You cannot force anyone to sell or buy anything in our societies anyhow. So sort of the basis is actually that both sides think that they win. And over the years, I mean, Sweden has built its wealth and prosperity on trade. And our labor unions have since long realized that if our companies don't survive, prosperity will go down. And we've done a lot of reforms. And someone said here that the globalization gets blamed for things that are really domestic policies. And I think that is often very, very true. And some of the reforms in Sweden has been focused not on protecting jobs, but protecting the possibility to find a new job. Right. And that gives more confidence and trust. Okay. And I think that is a very important thing to look into more.
Okay, the same question then to you to finish off, Pat, for this first round. Why is globalization such a hard case to make?
Well, I think Ireland is a perfect example of what can be achieved from globalization. It struck me this morning and last night as well that when Business Europe was forming itself in 1958, Ireland was introducing its first economic development program of opening up to the world. And being part of the European Union and joining the European Union in 1973 was part of that journey and a really critical part of that journey. And if you look what we have achieved in Europe on trade and investment, the single market is actually the most developed free trade and investment agreement in the world. And that's why we value being members of the European Union so much. But Ireland also is what the OECD would describe as a model of substance, because the foreign direct investment which we have attracted into Ireland is deeply embedded. Some of it came 60 years ago and is still there today, and it has evolved over time. And we now participate as a small open economy in global value chains in a very deep sense. We have developed really sophisticated ecosystems and clusters, which has helped the development of SMEs, as well as leveraged off the multinationals who have actually invested not only in Ireland, but have invested in Europe. And that is what a small economy like Ireland, being open to trade and investment in the world, can actually contribute to Europe. and also give a very good rate of return to people who choose to invest in Ireland and in Europe.
Okay, thank you, Pat. From now on, by the way, for the panel, my question, you can just jump in. I won't do it one by one in case. So, to what extent, if at all, is it the responsibility of business, as opposed to, or as well as policymakers, to make the case for globalization? You know, that is a slightly leading question, as you know, because some companies will say, it is not our job, it's not our responsibility. That suggests we're becoming more political. Emma said in her speech this morning, we are political, but we don't belong to political parties, ostensibly. So is there a role, even a self-interested role, frankly, for business to be much more active in making the case for globalization? Anybody join it? Carola?
Well, I'll jump on that one because my answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, if not even businesses speak well of globalization, who will? Yeah. And I think businesses, business organizations, we need to remind people. I mean, I'm really a true champion of globalization, perhaps because of my medical background. The gains that have been done in wealth, prosperity, lifespan the last 25, 30 years is unique to mankind. We shouldn't really have to defend it, but since not everyone wins all the time everywhere, I think it's very important that businesses constantly remind of the good things and do it with arguments that reach not only the brain. I think that's one of the mistakes we always made. It's so obvious, you know, so why don't people understand? We need to reach the heart. And I think we need to also remind people more of trade tends to be very sort of, well, we export this to China and that's good for us. We forget the enormous benefits of the imports. There's actually today, as we are sitting here, published a study by the chief economists at the Commission showing that the annual saving for consumers in Europe of cheap goods is 60 billion euros per year. And the greatest benefit of that is actually to the people who have the lowest wages. And that is also something we need to talk more about.
Right. Anybody wants?
I think it's what you are saying is very important. I think we have to think out of the box, the business people, and like Emma told us, I think we are not politicians, but we have to support them, and we have to go to the media and saying the benefits of the EU, the benefits of these policies. Otherwise, who will do this? And of course, it's good news. And media is always happy with bad news. Yeah. And I think we have to try to find a way how to elaborate what you are saying, the wellness fest, all these things that are very, very beneficial on social also in Europe. Nobody is saying this. Right. And I think we have to take our responsibility and maybe to go and say what we are thinking. Pat? Without be politicians.
Okay, okay. I'm not forcing you to become a politician, Bernard, don't worry. Pat?
Yeah, it goes back to the question of winners and losers from trade, or this particular phrase. One of the things we have to do is change with the world and prepare people for change. Yeah. And one of the key things is education and skills development. And we've seen it in my own country. We've seen that we would not have developed as an economy had we not taken steps to better educate our people, to make sure that the vast majority of our young people are going on to third-level education, getting better educations, preparing themselves for the future, to participate in this new, innovative, digitalized world. And I think that Sari mentioned the innovation principle. And I think that this is key for Europe, is to put the innovation principle at the center, and then to focus on how we prepare people for the future, educating them in science, technology, maths, and engineering, to enable them to take up really good, sustainable jobs, which give them excellent standards of living and a great quality of life.
Before I come to you, Ferdi, on education and skills, though, Pat, do you mean basically your focus here is actually passing the buck, in a slightly kind of provocative phrase, to governments in the education system, or are you saying industry has a role to play itself in providing education, training, and skills?
Oh, absolutely. I think industry has not only a role in providing education, apprenticeship programs, redesigning their apprenticeship programs for the 21st century. That's key. We also have a deep stakeholder involvement with governments, with the European Commission to design education programs, and working with our universities and our institutes of technology to deliver the education that people will need for the future. If you look at the rise of populism outside of Europe as well as in Europe, you will see that most of the people who feel they have lost out from globalization have not been educated in order to participate in globalization. So this is key for us, is this focus on education and focus on skills development, both in the workplace and in education systems themselves.
Ferdi.
Yes, I'm of course not representing business, so I feel a bit reserved to respond to this question, but let me maybe just add one thing from an academic perspective. I agree with a lot of what has been said, but I also do think that more communication from business representatives and more and better retraining is good, but it's not sufficient. If we look at research that has mainly been done in the US on the so-called China effect, so what consequences did the rise of China have on states and even local communities within the US? It showed that some people who lost their job because it was delocalized had been worse off for the next 15 years in terms of remuneration, wages. So I think telling them that T-shirts from China have become cheaper and even retraining them will not be sufficient to convince them of the benefits of free trade. So I think we also, and also business has to realize that it's something I'm really convinced of, that is also underpinned by literature, that legitimacy of free trade and domestic protection, so not only retraining but also protection, are really two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. If you're a European making T-shirts, you're not very keen on cheap, maybe Chinese imports. But that was not what Carola meant, I'm sure.
No. I think Sweden is actually the best example of how these two go together. A lot of support for free trade, but embedded in a strong domestic social system.
And I just wanted to add that I think it's sad that so much of the research comes from the US, which has a fundamentally different societal model from definitely from Sweden and from basically most of Europe. So I think sometimes it's not, the conclusions coming out of the US are not necessarily true for what policies we need in Europe, and I think we need to be very, very careful on that actually.
Well, okay, let's try and then drill down. I wanted to finish the session in about 10 minutes or so about talking about local communities and the role of businesses at the local level, since we are talking about the globe for the moment. But let's try and maybe hone in on some of the elements. Let's try and diagnose the issue and then maybe possibly find some policy prescriptions or some business-led solutions. So first of all, I mean, to what extent is it, let's do the simple one first. Is it a question simply of, or partially anyway, of businesses raising their game in telling people, making the case for globalization? I was struck this morning, I'm sure he didn't mean it to sound that way, but when Pierre said we have to use simpler language, that struck me as, with all respect, Pierre, a tiny bit patronizing. I'm sure he did not mean it in that spirit, but is it a question of, maybe you're right, maybe businesses is guilty, and you maybe the neutral observer, Ferdi, you can comment as well, of being too full of jargon and too technical when making the case which you think is self-evident for trade. So question one, and then think of all that. Question two, there is slight disagreement, but it's a complex issue in whether there are winners and losers. In which case, how do we handle that? And you mentioned the financial compensation of some sort. That's then gets some people worried about industrial policy, state aids, God knows what, and then all issues at the European level about anti-competitive practices. And then thirdly, I'm sure it's much more complex than that, but let's keep it simple. We haven't got that much time. This business of education and skills, and not just people have a better education and then they join a company and they get apprenticeships. If that's pretty good in itself, but somehow businesses and politicians, policymakers work together in a much more strategic, coherent, effective way. So first of all, is it a question simply of education? Should businesses just adapt, improve their educational game?
Well, if I'll start again then, I think business has several important roles to play. And I mean, we're talking lifelong learning here. So businesses are important in interacting with schools, with universities, in what you start out with your training. But we are living in a society where we'll all have to retrain and retrain continuously. And that needs to happen within companies. It needs to happen outside companies. Universities have to adapt. They can't run their 4 or 5 year programs. They have to look differently on how their part in retraining. One of the things that I think has been very successful in Sweden is that we have a transition system that we actually run together with the unions. So people who lose their jobs, there is a way for them to getting trained, and we agree, and I think that's one of the reasons that we have been rather successful in this. So there are very many ways that the system needs to change to accomplish, because we'll all, I think most of us had sort of, I mean, I'm a physician to start with. I definitely changed tack several times to get to where I am today, and that will just happen even more.
Right. Pat.
I think another big contribution that business can make is investment. And we shouldn't talk about trade in isolation. Trade and investment are intrinsically linked. And trade often follows investment. And when you look at global supply chains in particular and how they operate, investment is made and people start to export and import between each other. And this is very deep. And for example, when you're talking about our relationship with our major trading partners around the world, if you take the USA, in Ireland we have significant USA investment, and they employ about 150,000 people in our economy. But what is less known is that Irish companies also invest very significantly in the US. And we employ 100,000 people in the US. Now, when you consider the scale of Ireland and the scale of the US, us employing 100,000 people in the US is a significant contribution to the US economy. And that is where trade and investment are intrinsically linked. And they do actually enable these global supply chains to actually work. And if we try to diminish our conversations down to trade deficits, for example, we're missing the point of how a 21st century business world actually works. The final point I'd like to make is that in the presentation earlier today, what's really clear is how far advanced Europe is on social policy and on supporting people with very high levels of minimum wage, with good levels of social security, with providing people time off for pregnancy, for maternity leave. All of these things are far ahead in Europe as they were anywhere else in the world, and we shouldn't forget that. And in terms of developing our future policies, we should again recognize the important point which Sari made in her speech, and that is that trade and investment agreements shouldn't be used to try to solve all of the policy issues globally. We also have the ILO, we have the OECD. Trade and investment agreements should be enablers, and they should support the other policies that are out there.
Ferdi, do you agree with any of that?
Yeah, no, if I may, I'm going to respond to the last point that is made, so that trade agreements shouldn't be used or abused for all kinds of other objectives. If we go back to the very first free trade agreement that has ever been concluded, the real free trade agreement was between the US and Israel, 1985. Do you know how many pages it counted, or does anyone have a guess?
4?
No, it had 14 pages. If we then take CETA as an example of a recent trade agreement, it almost counted 1,600 pages. And that's without the interpretative declarations that were added in the end. So already trade agreements have expanded enormously, mostly because business were in demand of expanding the agenda. So go beyond tariffs and quota, but business argued services is also about trade, government procurement is also about trade, intellectual property protection is also about trade. So business have been a driving force of expanding the trade agenda towards regulations, basically, also. I think it's only a normal counter-reaction of trade unions and NGOs to say, okay, if driven by business, trade agreements have expanded that much, Let's then also use them, for example, to tackle a very important problem today, tax avoidance and tax evasion, which is partly a consequence of capital liberalization and pure trade liberalization. So I think there's nothing wrong or illogical in the argument of trade unions and NGOs to say if trade agreements have already expanded that much on demand of business, to also use them to tackle a number of other very important problems today, like tax avoidance and tax evasion, which could then help us redistribute the gains from trade to the losers. One of the problems why social security systems are today less in some member states, but less redistributive than they were a couple of decades ago is because governments are not able anymore to let the very wealthy or multinationals pay a fair contribution. And that is due to trade liberalization and capital liberalization. And I think trade agreements should actually be used to do something about that.
We weren't going to talk about tax per se, I think, but now you mentioned it, Ferdi, I think it's only fair that at least one of you, please, responds to that. I mean, do you agree? Is there any validity in what Ferdi just said about the tax issue? It's your chance to put your case.
Taxation is a very complex issue, and in order to arrive at rules and regulations around taxation, this needs to be done on an international basis. And in Ireland, we weren't involved in setting up the BEPS process at the OECD. That was the G20 and the OECD, but we participated very fully in it. And we have introduced measures within our own economy which actually reflect the outcome of the BEPS process, particularly in terms of innovation and how we support innovation. On digital taxation and issues like that, this is where we should actually be having these conversations, is at the OECD, and we should be taking the time to consider the system and make sure that we make the right decisions for the future. What we would be concerned about is that unilateral action, either at an EU level or a member state level, would actually stunt and restrict the growth of the European Union and its participation in the world of trade and digitalization. So we need to understand how digitalization works, and we're working with the OECD to do that. And this is where these conversations should take place. And it's an important issue, and we need to address it, and we need to reassure our citizens and our people that it is being addressed properly.
Thank you. Anybody else? Bernard?
Just a comment on this, on taxation and other sustainable chapters on the FTAs. I would like just to say something. 99% of our companies, typically in Belgium, are small companies. And it was also mentioned a couple of half hour ago that 90% of the growth will be outside the European Union. And thus, I think it's very important that the FTAs also have a chapter for SMEs to help these companies to go abroad and to give, and if this FTAs is too complicated and too big, it's only for multinationals. Right. I think Europe is also strengthened with a lot of SMEs.
Okay.
Don't forget it.
Right. Well, we only have 5 minutes left, roughly. So two things I want to cover now towards the end. First of all is we all seem to agree, you all seem to agree, that education skills improvement are paramount in this new globalized world, 21st century, both in national education systems and in terms of businesses' commitment and desire to do more themselves as businesses, education and skills. To what extent, though, can these two things be brought together? To what extent is there scope, as I hinted earlier, for a more strategic, coherent, cooperative approach between policymakers, politicians, civil servants, whether probably at national level, I suppose, at regional level on one hand, and business at the other, rather than just do your own thing in sort of semi-established silos? Is there scope for more strategic collaboration in education and skills between the two groups? And if so, how could that? And if so, how could that be made a reality?
If I can start, when we see today in Europe the lack of scientists, the lack of engineers. We in Belgium, we try to find engineers, we cannot find. Just we go to Romania, to other countries, same problem. It will be an enormous growth problem for Europe if we cannot find the right skills and the adequacy between what we need in business and what the education administration can provide. It's the only way to accelerate, because we don't have the time. We have to accelerate this, is to work really between the companies, the business, and the academics. Right. Typically, one idea is when I see in artificial intelligence, China organize it now in Shanghai with billions. We try a little bit in France, a little bit in Germany, a little bit in Sweden, a little bit, but small. Try to do something bigger, ambitious on the level of the EU.
Okay. Anybody else want to come in? Carola, no? Pat, briefly?
I think that education and skills is hugely important, and we've discussed that in great detail, or in some detail. But what's also important is that we give people opportunities, once they're educated, to work here in Europe. And one of the things which we need to do in Europe is we need to invest more in research and innovation. Right. And this is particularly important this year as we come to decide on the next multi-annual financial framework. President Tusk mentions this morning new areas for spending in security and defense. He mentioned also maintaining traditional areas like CAP and cohesion, and we agree with his perception on those. But let's not forget, as the Business Europe video very clearly pointed out, and Emma's speech pointed out, is that we are behind the US, Japan, in terms of our investment in innovation and research and development. And so we need to address that. We need to ensure, as Pascal Lamy, who I'm sure if Arantxa had been able to join us, she worked for Pascal in the past. Pascal did some excellent work for the European Union on the need to up our investment in Horizon 2020 type programs.
Carola, briefly before my final question.
Yeah, I just was thinking here that actually your question is a bit of a no-brainer. Okay. Why should business and politics not talk to each other? And I have never quite understood why. I mean, what you want to do with the money and wealth created by businesses, that's a political issue, and you can have different views on that. The fact that you want to create the wealth in the first place and then to distribute it, that should be a given. And that you even have to sort of pose of the question is a bit sad. Because it should be, if I was a politician, I would start out with, what can we do to create better opportunities for businesses to grow so I get more money to use for the things that I politically want to drive? That's the way it should be.
Let me try one final no-brainer question to keep you happy, Carola. However, this is a question for all of you to answer briefly in turn, please, very briefly. However complex and global supply chains are becoming, they ultimately are rooted in local communities. To what extent is it possible for businesses, and desirable, not just feasible, desirable, as well as being local employers and local investors, to be actually more actively involved in the communities in which they operate as kind of corporate citizens? Is that a role, or is that a bit too kind of far-fetched for businesses to aspire to as we try and face the challenges of a globalized economy in the 21st century? Do you want to start, Ferdi?
Yeah, but again, I don't feel very well placed to respond to this question, but let me maybe just put the bar very low. I think what business should certainly not do is to abuse globalization and the imperative of competitiveness, as well as global value change, as either a way to blackmail local communities to make concessions, because it's necessary for competitiveness, or to use global value change as an excuse to avoid their accountability and responsibility, because I think both really play in the cards of the anti-globalist narrative, and that's something we should all avoid. Brexit has been a warning, the election of Trump has been a warning for that, so to put the bar low, it's to avoid making such mistakes, what I would...
Okay, that's pretty provocative.
Bertrand.
I think for me, a lot of business communities already now integrate social inclusion in their strategy. I think nobody, and certainly listed company, cannot anymore to do avoid social impact. In big investments now, also the financial community request to have the stakeholders, and in the stakeholders to have a return on investment for the local communities. Because I think it's more and more integrated.
Thank you, Carola.
Yeah, well, I think I'll take a slightly different view again, because what you are talking about is a lot of, I think, when people think business, they think big, global, multinationals, exploiting here or doing this, that. That's actually not what the big part of business is. Most businesses fulfill their CSR responsibilities simply by existing. They create jobs in their societies. 90 to 95% of them are small companies. They are creating an environment. We have a technique for showing companies' welfare footprints. Mm-hmm. So from the company tax you pay and all the taxes the people who work for you pay, you can actually calculate how many teachers do we keep running in our local community. And that is one of the most important CSR contributions of companies all around the world.
Thank you. Final word to Pat.
Our cities are growing all the time, and economic agglomeration is happening across the world. But we shouldn't forget the importance of investment in regions as well. And if you take the example of Ireland again, which I understand best, we produce 6 of the world's top pharmaceutical products in Ireland. That production is not in the Dublin region on the whole. It's actually in the south of the country, and is supporting whole communities there. We produce 4 of every 5 cardiovascular stents in the world, and that's produced in the west of our country by medtech companies. And we're exporting dairy ingredients all over the world, and again that's produced in a border region in the northeast of the country. So regional development and how you interact with your communities at a regional level, and the importance that company investment and the ecosystems and the clusters they develop for SMEs to be part of that. Again, I would refer to Sari's paper where, you know, BASF, 1 job supporting 5 jobs in the community. And it's the same for us all. Investment in our regional communities, in our rural communities, is actually supporting not just jobs, but also communities themselves. And regional communities.
Thank you very much, Pat. We've run out of time. I hope you found that interesting and enjoyable, the audience. I certainly did. So could I ask you, therefore, please to give a big round of applause to our speakers.
Thank you.